Hey guys, this is Eric Weingartner with Weingartner Racing. Today's video is a good one. It's pretty much oval port versus rectangular port. You're like, that's not oval. Well, we'll get to this in a minute. That's what this video is about. I'm gonna cover as much of the details as I can. Now, in this video, you're gonna see graphs and pictures and stuff. Those are all from this book, which is all the information from all the dyno tests that were done on this 496. And on that, there were 6 different heads that were tested, a whole bunch of different manifolds. All that information's in here. So yeah, I'll be doing videos over that. But if you have a hard time seeing it on your screen, which I imagine most of you probably do, you can purchase the book at my website, wengines.com. The link will be in my description, or the address will be in the description for this. You can go there to the online store and you can purchase the books, and then you have all the information that even hasn't been on some of the videos yet. Plus, it's easier to see. Now, I want to talk slightly before I begin this about dyno numbers. When I say we, because you can hear me talk about we in this video a lot, the other we in this is a guy named Nick. He has a YouTube channel called DZ Performance. He volunteered this. He was a viewer, and he said, look, I've got a 496. Why don't we use this to test some stuff? And I was like, oh, great idea. So he had brought down the 496 and several of the sets of heads, and also most of the intake, well, all of the intake manifolds. And we went to Dunsmore Machine Shop in Enid and dynoed constantly for the 3 days to make this happen. Now, this was only one of the many tests that we had done. However, Nick had already dynoed up there where he is from in the Kansas City area. He'd already dynoed the baseline of that engine. So that engine had already been broken. He'd already had a dyno test done on that. He then, when we took it to Dunsworth, we did the initial dyno pull was exactly as he'd had it before, and was down 30 horsepower. I only mention this not because like the engine's down in power. It's because there are differences between dynos. We would like to think that you could go to X dyno in this state and go to X dyno in this other state and that they'll read the same. Well, it's much like flow benches, that it just isn't the case. And it doesn't mean that one's necessarily more wrong than others, but I can tell you there are nefarious ones where people will try to bump up their numbers to make them look better, because obviously if I have an engine that makes 800 horsepower, I'm probably going to sell more than if I had an engine that said I only make 600 horsepower. Which one would you buy? Well, obviously you'd go for the 800, even though if you took it to another place, it might make less power. So I only say all of this to say we took it to Dunsworth because I love that place. Gary is super cool, and his dyno is very tight. I have yet, and I'm repeating this, I have yet to take an engine to Gary to have it dynoed and then gone somewhere else and make less power, ever, which is rare. There was another dyno that I was primarily using probably a year and a half ago, and that one did, of course, read much higher. So just to give you an idea, and you can go back and look at it, my big block Chevy that was in my Camaro, I made like 1120 on one dyno. We took it to Dunsworth and made 1060. So point I'm trying to get at is, even though the numbers might be like, wow, that doesn't look very great, it actually is pretty good numbers, but that doesn't really make a difference. It's only for the purposes of this video. It's really great for showing comparisons. So I can say on the same dyno, and actually these were tested on the same day too, how much more power did this make than this? And that's what this is good for. But the numbers aren't made to sell anything, is what I'm trying to say. So anyway, gets through that. So what's this engine that this was tested on before I start talking about the heads? Well, it was your basic 496. It's got a scat rotating assembly, and I'm going to call it Maul pistons, because until someone from Maul or Maul-E calls me and tells me you're saying it wrong, I'm not going to do that. And the reason why I say that is because, for instance, I've been saying Sains forever. Well, finally someone from Sains actually contacted me and it's like, well, you know, that's an Argentina name. That's Signs. Which in America, like, that doesn't look like signs. You need to, that's just the way they say it. So until someone from Maul calls me and says, hey, it's Maul-E, I'm going to keep calling it Maul, because I've heard it that way more than I've heard it Maul-E ever. So, and I'm not trying to insult anybody. I'm just being honest. But anyway, it has those pistons in it. The compression ratio varies, which we'll talk about depending on the heads, because the chamber size was different, which I'll get to. And it's got a hydraulic roller cam, 243, 247, 630 lift, 110 lobe separation. It's a custom Lenati, and Nick had spec'd all that cam. I didn't have anything to do with that at all. We did use solid lifters on the hydraulic roller cam and just last them at 6,000s, hopefully to prevent valve float, But I'm gonna go ahead and tell you on every single head that was tested. So we tested 6 heads. There were obviously the 317s, the 290s, a set of AFR 265s, AFR Enforcers, Brodix Race-Right 294s, Brodix Race-Right 270s. All those heads had valve float above 6,300 RPM. Well, the Enforcers went into it much earlier, but all of them had valve float. These heads have been tore down just because I want to show what's on the inside, because some people accuse me of porting the heads and cheating up these 317s. But also I tore them apart just to look to see if there was signs of valve float, and there absolutely was. Which I might do another video of that so you can locate how to see if there's valve float. But anyway, so 6,300 all of them, because on all fairness, this one might have made more if it hadn't gone into valve float. That one was, I think it was signing off. But anyway, the intakes that were used on this, and this is the part that's probably going to frustrate you, and I understand that completely. The intakes that were tested to compare these two were single planes. You might say, why didn't you use dual planes? Well, on this head, this 290, we tested every intake that would fit it. So in a 454.0, an Edelbrock Performer RPM, an HP 2017, a YN Stealth, which is an air gap design, the Edelbrock Performer 2.0. Which isn't every intake that they make for it, but it's every intake we had that fit it. On this one, we only tested 2, and mostly because of time constraints. It was a YN Stealth, or sorry, not the YN Stealth, a YN Track Warrior, and an Edelbrock 454R, but it had been mildly ported. So you might say, well, when you compare these two, did you do the Edelbrock 454R versus the Edelbrock 454O? No, because it wouldn't have been fair, because that one had been modified. So the comparison, this is the letdown, a YN Track Warrior intake on this one, but an Edelbrock 454O on this one. As all fairness, those intakes look very close to similar to each other stock. But it is what it is. I know it's not ideal, but at least you'll get some comparison from this. Now, next Sunday, I'm going to do a video on all the oval port heads, which would be this one versus the AFR 265 versus the Brodix Race-Right 270s. Now, those all got tested with multiple intakes of the same one. So that's probably a better comparison as far as that goes, you know, part to part. But I wanted to be upfront with that. So anyway, let's talk about the heads. These are Promaxx heads. They came directly from Promaxx. Jason was nice enough to send these to me to use. In the last video, I said I got them for free. It wasn't entirely for free. I mean, I didn't pay for them, but I got to use them. So eventually they'll have to go back, but he's letting me test a bunch of things on them as well. Anyway, he had him, I said, just send him up for a hydraulic roller. And the only thing that was modified at all from stock was I changed the valve locks to a minus 50 thousandths valve lock. And what that does is it reduces the installed height and it gives me more spring pressure. So at each head that was tested, all the heads had 175 pounds on the seat and about 440 open pressure, which still wasn't enough to prevent valve float. Is what it is. Anything else? No, nothing else is modified. What you see here, I'm looking down in it, is exactly how they come from factory. Now, this 317 comes factory with a 2300 188 exhaust valve. The 290s had a 225 by 188 exhaust valve. And as you can tell, it looks like I've done this work. No, that's actually, if you were to order them, this is how you will get them from Promaxx. I didn't do that. Exactly the way they came. So there's that. Now this is the part that's going to mess with you, and I'm going to show you this. The 317s come with a 119cc chamber. The 290s come with a 110cc chamber stock. I didn't mill them or nothing. That's what they came with stock. Now, why is that important? Well, obviously, if you're watching this video, you're thinking, well, hey, the smaller port, more velocity, that one's going to be the one's making more torque than this bigger one. That's got to be the winner. But there might be other factors involved, such as the chamber. Because this chamber is smaller, the compression ratio is much higher actually on the smaller one than it is on this one. I mean, 9cc difference in chamber size. And you might say, what's that mean? Well, let's go to my book because I can't wait to show you some of this stuff. I took measurements for the entire head, and this is it. So if you want to know all the cross-sectional areas from inside the head, even the average cross-sectional area, I measured all of it. I even weighed the valve. Yeah, I measured the valve too. But at 119cc chamber with these 317s, you get a compression ratio of 10.25. Now to the Promaxx 290s, and I called them rovals because they're supposed to be ovals, but if you notice, they're a roval, rectangle and oval, but they're much smaller than that. These are all their measurements and their average CSA, but So remember, the 317s had a compression ratio of 10.25. The Promaxx 290s were 11.08. So as you can tell, it's a pretty good bump. Almost a full point, but not quite. It's a pretty big jump. And as you can tell, when we get ready to do the AFR 265s, they're closer to the 290s than these 317s. But anyway, so there's that. The flow numbers, by the way, are actually here too. So we'll take a quick gander at those because I flowed them and the flow numbers are in here. So just to give us something to think about. There's a Brodix 270 stock, which isn't this video, but here we go. These are the 290s. Both were flowed on my Signs digital 680 bench, 4310 bore. It's not notched. And here are the flow numbers. Now, if you notice, the big block Chevy has a long runner and a short runner. So both were flowed. Usually whenever you see advertised flow numbers for a big block Chevy, they only give the long one because that's the good one. But anyway, I gave both. And the exhaust is flowed without an exhaust pipe. If you attach an exhaust pipe, it usually flows more. So we look, and I'm just going to hit a few of them. This is the long runner, so this would be the good runner. And this is the 290, so it's the small one I'm talking about first. It flowed at 400, 274, which is really good on the long runner, and 266 on the short runner at 400. And since we had about 630 lift, we'll say 600, it went 334 at 600 and 327 on the short runner. Exhaust side, peaks 282, it's pretty good, and 205. Now, how's this compared to that bigger 317 head? Remember the 317, this one has a bigger intake valve. It shouldn't move more air. Well, let's take a gander and see. It moved at 400, 268. So it's actually flows less at 400 than the other head. And on the long runner. On the short runner, it's actually higher at 271. At 600, it's 347 and 340, which is definitely better than what the other one did. And if we look at peaks, by the way, it's like 359. So it's not bad. 350 on the short runner. The exhaust actually flowed less. You might say, what's wrong with that? Did they do something wrong? It's probably just casting variances because it's close, but it's off by about 10 CFM. Not a huge deal. It is what it is. I will say this, and you'd have to watch some other videos. You really truly can't judge an exhaust port by the exhaust flow because we're not really close on the intake flow on the flow bench, but we're nowhere near on the pressures on the exhaust. So this just tells me if it's good or bad, and this just says it's not bad. So there's that. Now, there's most of the information you need on the actual head itself. Let's see how they compare. So we're going to do the raw numbers first. So here we go. Here are dyno numbers. This is the Promaxx 290 roval head. That's this head. You might say, why did they do the roval? The idea is that you get more area at the cross section, at the small pinch area. So it's still small, but got enough area to support higher RPMs. That's the reason for it. So it's truly not an oval. It's a roval, but the AFRs are exactly this way. And allegedly, both of these heads are allegedly a imitation or copy of the AFR heads. For instance, the 317th was allegedly, not entirely 100% can positively say this, is the copy of the AFR CNC ported 315, and the 290 is allegedly the copy of the AFR 290. So that's the reason why they look that way, and that's why when we talk about the AFR, it's going to match this. So all right, to the numbers. So this is the Promaxx, the 290, and I got the pretty good compression in this one, obviously. At 6,300, it makes 6088.6. Now you might say, man, it's still climbing. Yeah, again, I could have maybe pulled a little bit more, but again, what happens is it starts going into valve float, so that kind of bummer. And it made 631 torque, which is pretty good. All right, pretty good. Small port and all that. Well, let's look at how it compares to this big port. Let's go on the old 317 here. That's with a different intake, so you got to be mindful. And this one, 685 at 6,300, and it was really still climbing, so it wasn't pootering out. So we kind of compare these two. That's 678, almost 679, compared to the 685. So you could tell, even with it being down on compression, so it's for sure down on compression, no doubt about it, it's making more horsepower. But what about the torque? Because you know that smaller runner, that's got to be the torque, right? Well, it did, because these were like 625, so it's down about 5 foot-pounds of torque. Even though that runner's much smaller, it's only down about 5 torque. Now here's the thing, That's really hard to judge, really, really hard, because don't forget, yeah, it's down, this bigger head's down 5 foot-pounds of torque, but that's got so much smaller chamber that the compression ratio is up, building more torque. So you see the difference? But anyway, these are the raw numbers. You probably would like to see a graph, and I've got that. That's this. This will give you a better picture. I'll just flip my book here, drop some stuff while I'm at it. Here are your graphs. Let me pull off my sticky note. So the red line here is the Promaxx 317 heads. So that's these big ones. And this black line is the Promaxx 290s. If you look, we actually started making pulls much lower because people complained that we weren't making pulls low enough to get for you low RPM guys. So, and some of the other graphs you'll see on here were way down here. Early on, we didn't. So we actually tested the 290 first because it done so many different intakes. I think it was the second head we tested and a bazillion different intakes, and then changed procedures to pull a lower RPM. All that information's in the book. But anyway, so you could tell, yeah, we pulled that single plane further down. Both of these are with a single plane again. But if you look, the 290, if you look, the 290 is much better at, say, about 4,000, 4,200. You could see how much the gap this has over that 317. And then once you hit where your peak torque pretty much occurs, they're not that far off. And even though this says 629.9, that's the torque. It's just barely above what the other one is, but the other one's tracking with it. And this is where that 317 makes more right about, looks like, let's count these, 56, yeah, about 5,600 RPM and above, it's better. And then you can start seeing valve float from when we tried to pull further. See, that one goes to 6,500. That's what happens when we try. They'll valve float, and then they start tracing that line. It's just what it is. So, as you could tell, if you 317s are really only good from 5,600 and above. So if you were purchasing both these heads, you're like, which one should I put on my street engine? Both of them are fine. I mean, if you look, it's not that you are giving up torque down here. True, no doubt about that. But for the most of your majority of your torque in the, say, 5,000 range, you're about the same, which then you're like, well, I'm not driving 5,000 RPM on the street. True, but this one has much higher compression ratio than this one. So if you're also driving on the street, you have to be aware that you probably should add some kind of additive to that head that you may not have to add to this one. So, and this also leads up to another question, because this is something Nick and I are trying to do this again, to retest this. What we want to find out is, if I mill this head down, so I'm going to mill this head to 110 cc's. That would give it the same chamber size as that head. Now, I am going to redo the valve job because I just think it needs to be improved. Those are the only two things that's going to be done. And we're going to see if what happens, what I think will happen is, this red line here is actually going to end up being the same or higher, because that's more related, I think, to compression ratio. So you can say, well, the bigger head makes it a sloppy down low, but I don't think that's quite the case. I think the compression ratio loss made up some of this difference. Now, what it may happen is I may mill them down and it gets closer to this, but not quite the same. And it may end up looking something like this does here, where there's very little difference. Maybe, but the compression ratio thing is really what kind of throws the monkey in the wrench. And yes, it also does have a different intake manifold too. But in all fairness, the 317's intake is probably better, that Y and Track Warrior, than the Edelbrock 454O. But we're going to try to mill it down and see if we can't get that to come up higher. I think it will. So back to your argument, which one would you rather have? Well, what do you want? Both look like they're going to be fine. Neither one of these are a dog. I mean, even you saw this, for the most part, it's only 5 foot-pounds of difference. This one down here is more obvious than in that. But still, you know, I don't know what it is down here. It looks like 580 or, yeah, 590 versus 580 torque. Really? I mean, that's enough to get your wagon or whatever you got to move anyway. But, so either one's a perfect choice for the streets, what I'm trying to get at. But if you're definitely wanting the lower RPMs, that 290 is not a bad deal. But remember, your compression ratio is going to be higher. So just something to think about. Both of them are great heads, though. Can't argue that. And just a heads up and let you know, they're great stuff. I don't think anybody's going to be disappointed with the results from these. So Next week, I'm going to compare all three of the oval port heads. So you can look for that on next Sunday's one. It'll be the Race Right 270s versus these versus the AFR 265, which is very interesting because I know already some of you are thinking, well, wait a minute. If 290s made more torque than those 317s, well, what if you go to the 265? Is it going to make even more torque? You got a small runner. Or what about that Race Right 270? It's even smaller. That one's got to make more torque, right? Because that one's all of them compared with the same intake manifold. They all have a closer compression ratio. Boy, that's going to be an interesting one. Well, that's next week. This one, like I said, I'm going to mill down, recut the valve job, and try again. So anyway, guys, remember, I'm no Superman. This is information, and what I mean by that is I make plenty of mistakes. I am nowhere near perfect, and these opinions are just my opinions. You should take them not as gospel, but as just one more piece of information that you can use or discard. It's up to you. Just something to think about. But that's what I mean when I say I'm no Superman. I make mistakes, and it's just information. You guys, take care.